As we continue our look at archaeology in the New Testament, we want to look at some of the sites in archaeology of Paul's journeys. Scripture records 3 different missionary journeys, the first being in Acts chapter 13 and 14, and this occurred around 45 through 48 AD. Second missionary journey went back to several of these places as he did on the third and visited some new areas as well. One of the first stops was on Cyprus. Cyprus is Latin for copper. Herod the Great, who we've looked at and seen some of his building projects in Israel, imported copper from the mines that he leased from Augustus Caesar, from Salamis. But on Cyprus was found an inscription of a ruler, Sergius Paulus, who is mentioned in Acts chapter 13 and 7. He was proconsul of Cyprus. This inscription was found in 1877. Actually, it was found in Rome, but he was the proconsul on Cyprus. After leaving Cyprus, Paul went up into what is today Turkey, Asia Minor, and at Antioch of Pisidia began preaching and proclaiming Christ. He apparently was quite successful, for later this is where Pliny, the Roman procurator of that area, wrote to Trajan. He says this contagious superstition is not confined to the cities only, but has spread through the villages and rural districts as well. So this was the beginnings of the Christian movement in this area. Antioch of Pisidia has some amazing ruins, the first being the temple of Augustus Caesar, and ruled from 27 BC to 14 AD. And some amazing ruins still there, as well as coins from Pisidian Antioch, where Paul preached. These are the Greek walls and towers of Pisidian Antioch as well. He next went to Perga, and there also are remains from Roman times. It is from Perga that John Mark went back and departed in Acts 13 and verse 13. It's a very large stadium there, so this area was very advanced and had a good number of people throughout the area who had come here. Then later from Troas, we have what's called the Macedonian Call. And into Europe, Paul and several of his companions go. And the first stop was Philippi. Paul and Silas and Timothy and Luke join up to preach the gospel here. Philippi was a very important site, and as with many of the New Testament cities that Paul chose, they were strategic in the growth of early Christianity. They were hubs from which Christianity could spread out into the surrounding area. Philippi started out as a small village called the Springs. Philip II of Macedonia conquered it in 357 BC. A great battle was had here in 42 BC between Antony and Octavian, where he defeated Brutus and Cassius. This became a Roman colony on the Egnatian Way, and many Roman soldiers actually were settled here to increase Rome's power and presence in the area. Of course, at Philippi, Paul began preaching. He converted Lydia. Here we have the traditional site of the jail in Philippi where Paul and Silas were imprisoned. And now we look at the Forum of Philippi, a very great city. And it was on the Egnatian Way, a major thoroughfare for people traveling. And this road would have been traveled by Paul as he came and left, going on to various localities. The river next to Philippi was where Lydia and the Philippian jailer were baptized by Paul. Very amazing ruins. Including an inscription with the name of Claudius Caesar. There's the battle site, and here's another inscription found from Alexander the Great at Philippi. Paul next went to Thessalonica from Philippi. There's not a lot of ruins there, but we have some from the Agora, the marketplace in Thessalonica. And we also have a mile marker from the Ignitia road that Paul would have traveled, chronicling the miles along the way. Berea also was visited by Paul, and the Ignatian Way can be seen there. There is a synagogue in Berea where Paul preached. This is a recreation of a much later synagogue, and the site of the actual synagogue is not known. Paul then later went to Corinth, and the ruins there are truly amazing and quite numerous. Corinth is on the lower part of Greece, in the Achaean Peninsula. A canal now crosses it where ships can go through. And Corinth was a great trading city, seafaring city, located in the middle of the Isthmus of Corinth. It's 2 miles from north to the Gulf of Corinth, and the Saronic Gulf is 7 miles to the east. The population was estimated at a couple 100,000 during the time of Paul. Excavations began here in 1896 by the American Schools of Classical Studies. Here's the Temple of Apollo at Corinth. And then the Agora at Corinth, where the marketplace was. Much pottery was found there of different styles and dates, and several busts of various Roman emperors, the meat market. Great significance is what's called the Erastus Inscription, which was discovered in 1929. Erastus was the city treasurer, and he laid a pavement and recorded this deed in this inscription. Most likely it's the same one that Paul talks about and wrote to and names in Romans 16:22, Erastus. And here is where this inscription was found. Also, another inscription was found at Corinth, the Synagogue of the Hebrews, it says, discovered in 1898. There's certainly some debate as to whether this is from the 1st century or a bit later. But it must have been over the doorway to the synagogue, and other artifacts from this time have been found. The menorah here from the synagogue likewise. Paul was brought before the judgment in Corinth, and this is probably the very location, the Bema, dating back to 50 AD, right during the time of Paul. And this can be seen in Acts chapter 18, verse 12 through 17. Not too far north of Corinth is the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. a great theater there and other places of worship. And one of the more interesting finds at Delphi is an inscription with the name of Gallio. 9 fragments were found in 1908, and they date to the time of Claudius, the emperor, who ruled from 41 to 54 AD. It mentions Gallio, the proconsul of Corinth, who ruled from only 1 year, 51 or 52 AD.
Acts 18:12 reads as follows: While Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews of Corinth made a united attack on Paul and brought him to the place of judgment. In the next picture, we see this place of judgment at Corinth.
Again, you could read about this in Acts chapter 18. This inscription is very important because it helps us date when Paul was at Corinth, because Gallio was in power at that time, 51 or 52 AD. Next, Paul went to Athens, kind of the center of the philosophical and religious world of that time, the Greek worship on the Parthenon. Of great significance was Paul's speech on Mars Hill.
Part of Paul's speech on Mars Hill is as follows: While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, Men of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, To an unknown God. Now what you worship as something unknown, I am going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by hands. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands people everywhere to repent. For he set a day when he will judge the world with justice, by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to all men by raising him from the dead. So even in Athens, the philosophical and religious center of the Greek and Roman world, Paul brings up the resurrection of Jesus as giving mankind hope.
Later, Paul went to Ephesus and back across the Aegean Sea, and didn't stay there long on the second missionary journey. He was on his way to Jerusalem, but later came back and spent a couple of years there. The ruins at Ephesus are extensive and very impressive. Rode down to the Celsus Library, which held 15,000 scrolls and was built around 115 to 125 AD.
Paul's impact on Ephesus was great. And it reads in Acts chapter 19 and verse 18, a number who had practiced sorcery brought their scrolls together and burned them publicly. When they calculated the value of the scrolls, the total came to 50,000 drachmas. In this way, the word of the Lord spread widely and grew in power.
Paul's preaching was having a great impact in Ephesus. In fact, it threatened idol manufacturing industry. Demetrius, the silversmith, got opposition against Paul. Many people got together. From Acts chapter 19 and verse 28, then we read this. When they, the people of Ephesus, heard this, they were furious and began shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Soon the whole city was in an uproar, and all of them rushed into the theater together. The assembly was in confusion. Some were shouting one thing and some another. Most of the people did not even know why they were there. When they realized that he, Paul, was a Jew, they shouted in unison for about 2 hours, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." So Paul left them. He took the disciples with him and had discussions daily in the lecture hall of Tyrannus. This went on for 2 years, so that all the Jews and Greeks who lived in the province of Asia heard the word of the Lord. Acts chapter 19, verse 9 and 10. We want to look now briefly at some of the artifacts in the Clayton Museum of Ancient History. This is located in York, Nebraska, on the campus of York College. A great number of artifacts have been donated to this museum. Beginning as far back as 800 years before Christ, we see some examples of Hebrew writing on ostraca. Remember, ostraca are broken pieces of pottery on which different people wrote messages and recorded events and so forth. Also in the Clayton Museum, we have several examples of Egyptian relics. And here we have Amenhotep III and Thutmose III with their names engraved in hieroglyphics. Thutmose III is possibly the Pharaoh of the Exodus, though we're not certain exactly who reigned at the time that Moses led the people of Israel out of Egypt. Also, Ramses III, there is an oval plaque here in this display. Engraved in hieroglyphics and filled with black paste, it reads, Ramses, ruler of Heliopolis. As we come closer to the Roman times and some coins from the times of Rome, we have a coin from Emperor Domitian, who reigned from 81 to 96 AD. Also, a little earlier, there's a silver shekel of Tyre, which was minted in Tyre somewhere around 95 to 94 BC. The shekel is perhaps the one cited in the Bible as the 30 pieces of silver paid to Judas for his betrayal of Jesus. A little later, we have a coin from Emperor Trajan's reign, a silver denarius from 96 to 117 AD. And then some coins of Emperor Augustus from 27 BC. He reigned until 14 AD. And of course, very interesting, a coin from Pontius Pilate's reign, 26 to 36 AD. We've spoken briefly earlier about some of the changes that took place between the Testaments around 400 BC up until the time of Jesus' birth in 4 BC. And one of the interesting things that happened there was the extensive use of coins. Apparently under the Greeks, Alexander the Great and his generals, it became more popular to mint coins with the ruler's name on these coins. Going back farther, some other artifacts from the Hittite Empire. You might recall in our study of the Old Testament archaeology, the Hittites were sort of a long-lost civilization until fairly recently. But this is an iron lance from around 1500 years before Christ from the Hittite Empire. Also, interestingly, a Syro-Hittite terracotta bull rider figure, and some have postulated this is possibly Baal from around 2000 to 1000 BC. And of course, in the Old Testament, Baal worship was one of the pagan idols that the pagans worshiped. Baal worship was very widespread in Israel, and they had to contend with that as a competition to their worship in God. Also, we read frequently about the Ashira. And here we have depicted Ashira, the Canaanite goddess of fertility, dating from around 900 to 600 BC. In fact, this is probably the same goddess that Elijah refers to with his contest on Mount Carmel with the prophets of Baal. Elijah says, "Bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Ashira who eat at Jezebel's table." So very interesting to see a depiction of the Ashira, Canaanite goddess of fertility here. There's a number of artifacts also found in this museum, this bronze spearhead from around 900 BC from Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia, as you might recall, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates River, sometimes called the Fertile Crescent. And Mesos is two Greek words, meso in the middle of, potamos is river, so Mesopotamia means the land between the two rivers. We have here a panel depicting the ancient goddess Isis in a kneeling position, dating from around 818 to 712 BC. Many of the artifacts in the Clayton Museum are from the time of the Roman Empire. Here we see a recreation of a Roman centurion of the 1st century. Around him, some of the artifacts that we'll be looking at from the time of the Romans. Another depiction, a recreation of what a Roman centurion might have looked like in full armor. But here's some actual relics from the time of Jesus, shortly thereafter. Roman shoes with the hobnails intact. Actual Roman legionary helmet from around 50 to 100 AD. Truly amazing to see something that probably Jesus and Paul would have seen as well on the Roman centurions of their time. And then the Romans were often the soldiers engaged in construction projects in the lands that they conquered. These are actually nails from Scotland, dating from around 883 to 87 AD, when the Romans had earlier invaded Scotland and built fortresses there. A Roman javelin and a cavalry sword from around 300 AD. And then Roman siege machines. They would put rocks and various items in these slings and launch them towards the fortress that they were laid siege to. They have some other relics from the Roman army, a medal that Roman soldier would wear, and then a scabbard mount for the sword of a Roman soldier, and actually a military diploma fragment. This dates from around 90 to 95 AD. Here we have a grooming kit, probably that these Roman soldiers would carry along with them, including a pair of scissors, a folding knife, a razor, a sewing needle, a comb, and a folding mirror, all from somewhere from the beginning of this era to around 300 AD. Roman axe heads from the 1st century AD, and a Roman legionary stamped brick. When the legionnaires would conquer new areas, they would often be involved in construction, and they would put their legionary insignia on the bricks that they were building the new facilities out of. And as mentioned, often they would lay siege to different of their enemies' fortresses, and here's a signet military siege ring in bronze from 0 to 200 AD. On it you can see a siege ladder. Here is a signet ring with legionary eagle motif, and it dates from somewhere from 0 to 100 AD. Another ring with a ship image on it, silver with a carnelian gem, again dating from 0 to 100 AD. And another look at a Roman siege military ring. Well, the Romans didn't do fighting and conquering all the time, but they played games at times, and here some gaming dice from 100 BC to around 300 AD. Not sure of exact date, but They had time for enjoyment, apparently, at times as well. And what most of them were looking forward to, as people today too, is retirement. And so here's a Roman military diploma dating from around August 20th, 127 AD. A Roman military diploma was a document inscribed in bronze certifying that the holder was honorably discharged from the Roman armed forces and or had received the grant of Roman citizenship from the emperor as a reward for 25 years of service. Earlier we looked at the city of Philippi, and many Roman soldiers retired to this city and were awarded land and property. And this happened throughout the empire. And this was one way the Romans kept control of the areas by dispersing retired soldiers into cities throughout the conquered lands. So these are some of the things that you can see at the Clayton Museum of Ancient History, located in York, Nebraska, on the campus of York College. It is certainly worth a trip there to view in person these many excellent remains and artifacts of the time of the Roman Empire. Of course, all of these artifacts give credence to the historical reality of Jesus and the apostles and the times in which they lived.
And so these are some of the sites from Paul's missionary journeys that confirm their reality and his presence. And we have many artifacts from the first century that attest to the truthfulness and reliability of the New Testament.